Late 1944. The freezing, shattered woods of the Hürtgen Forest. German intelligence officers interrogating newly captured prisoners and analyzing fresh radio intercepts are confronted with a tactical impossibility. The troops assaulting their fortified lines belong to the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, but German commanders know this cannot be true. Just weeks prior, their artillery had practically annihilated this exact division, inflicting catastrophic casualties. By every rule of military attrition, the 4th Infantry should be a shattered, combat-ineffective remnant. Yet here they are, fully staffed, heavily armed, and attacking again. How could an entire American division be systematically destroyed, only to seamlessly reappear from the ashes like a ghost? The answer to the German commander's bewilderment was not supernatural resilience, nor was it a triumph of simple battlefield heroism. The terrifying reality facing the Wehrmacht was born from a deeply controversial doctrine that fundamentally redefined how the United States waged war. This is a forensic look at the American individual replacement system. To solve the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of global industrial warfare, the War Department engineered a pipeline that operated less like a traditional military organization and more like a mass production assembly line. In most other armies, when a division sustained catastrophic casualties, it was pulled off the line, sent to the rear, and meticulously rebuilt over several months. The American High Command chose a radically different path. They designed a logistics network that treated individual infantrymen essentially like interchangeable spare parts. It was a chillingly efficient framework, capable of continuously funneling fresh personnel directly into active combat zones. This ensured that a unit's combat strength remained static on a headquarters map, regardless of the attrition on the ground. The division's famous patch would never disappear from the front, even if the men wearing it were entirely different from the week before. It was a marvel of military efficiency, masking a cold, factory-like treatment of human lives. How did this relentless, unprecedented logistical pipeline manage to constantly outpace and break the German war machine? And what was the hidden, devastating cost paid by the soldiers in the mud when the military prioritized raw, numerical strength over unit cohesion? To understand the immense strain that created this system, we must examine a fundamental, yet deeply contentious decision made by American strategic planners long before the first boots hit the mud of the Hurtgen. In early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the German Wehrmacht, despite years of brutal attritional warfare, still fielded roughly 315 divisions. The Red Army commanded an astonishing 500 combat divisions. The British Army, though smaller, maintained about 75 active divisions. The total planned strength for the entire United States Army, fighting a global war across two distinct hemispheres, was stabilized at a remarkably small, standardized number, exactly 90 combat divisions. This 90-division gamble was not a result of a manpower shortage, though there were valid concerns about the industrial and agricultural needs of the arsenal of democracy. It was a deliberate, cold, statistical calculation made in Washington, heavily influenced by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Marshall and his advisors believed that, rather than fielding hundreds of understrength or inexperienced formations, the American military machine should concentrate its massive industrial power onto a compact, highly mobile, and intensely powerful force. This approach would conserve the limited shipping tonnage needed to transport and, critically, continuously supply a modern armored and mechanized army across the Atlantic and Pacific. The strategy, while robust on paper, contained a chilling, unstated corollary. If only 90 divisions were ever to exist, and the American operational doctrine demanded a relentless, crushing offensive along a massive front, there could be no significant strategic reserve. The available divisions could not be effectively rotated off the line once they entered combat. There would be no replacement divisions waiting in the rear to take over as whole units became exhausted. To win, these 90 divisions would have to stay in combat, moving forward, essentially forever, until the war was won. The profound flaw in this mathematical approach was not exposed by the grand strategy of a command room map, but by the jagged topography and unyielding resistance encountered on the ground in Western Europe. Consider the reality facing the German or British high commands. When a Wehrmacht division was ground down to perhaps 40 or 50% of its authorized combat strength, the standard doctrinal procedure was to withdraw it entirely. The division's famous designation would be physically removed from the battle order, sent to a quiet sector in a different part of Europe, such as Norway, Denmark, or even a shattered area on the Eastern Front, to be slowly rebuilt. There, it would absorb new conscripts, integrate fresh officers, receive new equipment, and, most importantly, have the time and space to train as cohesive units at the platoon, company, and battalion levels over a period of 3 to 6 months before ever seeing combat again. The American strategy rendered this logistical luxury illegal. There was no deep, quiet rear to retreat to. Every newly arrived ship carried individual men and individual shells, not whole units. This created a paradox. On the abstract maps of the 12th Army Group, a specific division, such as the 4th Infantry Division, represented a stable, authorized strength of approximately 14,037 men. When a corps commander, such as Major General Leonard T. Giroux, looking at his overlays, ordered the 4th Division to attack a specific objective in the vicinity of the Hürtgen Forest, his orders were predicated on the assumption that this unit possessed full authorized strength, not the real-time, bleeding remnants in the foxholes. To illustrate the human cost when this statistical model collided with industrial-scale combat, we must look forensically at the experience of that single unit, the 4th Infantry Division, known by its distinctive ivy leaf patch. On September 14, 1944, having already fought its way through Normandy and helped liberate Paris, the 4th Infantry Division crossed the German border. The initial crossing near the fortified West Wall bunker lines was met with only moderate resistance, fueling a sense among some American commanders that the German defenses were ready to crack. This was a profound misinterpretation. For the German defenders, falling back meant shortening their supply lines and fighting in terrain they knew intimately. And one of the most brutal pieces of that terrain lay directly across the American axis of advance. The Hürtgen Forest was not a natural obstacle. It was a military system. It comprised 50 square miles of dense, dark fir trees, rising up to 100 feet, with branches so tightly interlocked they choked out natural light even during a winter day. The forest floor was a chaotic tangle of deep ravines, muddy gullies, hidden minefields, and centuries of waterlogged depressions that swallowed heavy vehicles whole. In the preceding century, the Prussian military had meticulously surveyed the entire forest, pre-registering every crossroad, creek, and ridge for artillery fire. When the 4th Infantry Division, alongside the 9th Infantry Division, received the order to clear this area to protect the right flank of the American First Army's advance toward the Roer River dams, they were effectively marching into a pre-designed killing zone. A specific operational report, archived from a November 1944 daily log of the 4th Division's G3 Operations section, detailing the activity of just one of its regiments, the 12th Infantry, provides a forensic glimpse of the attrition. The log entry for November 8th, just days into the major push, describes a routine attack that became a massacre. As the regiment moved over a ridgeline, the German defense saturated the pre-targeted slope with mortar fire, felling dozens of men in minutes, without a single American soldier seeing the enemy. Later that same day, as the 1st Battalion attempted to flank a known bunker complex, they stumbled into an unmarked minefield, losing half a platoon before the survivors were forced to retreat back into the forest, where artillery tree bursts, exploding shells that rained down supersonic wooden splinters and shrapnel, decimated the retreating troops from above. Another specific document from that week, a raw after-action summary compiled by a regimental surgeon, cataloged the division's losses. The statistics for one 72-hour period are terrifying. Only 20% of the casualties were recorded as caused by gunshot wounds, confirming what the men on the ground already knew. The vast majority of injuries were the result of the constant, unceasing artillery fire and the unpredictable terror of the anti-personnel mines, including the dreaded S-mine, which bounced 4 feet in the air before detonating in a lethal spray of steel ball bearings. These primary documents reveal that for every 10 combat troops the division lost, only 3 or 4 might be recovered, treated, and returned to duty over several weeks. The rest, the killed, the severely maimed, the missing, represented a permanent hemorrhage of personnel. Yet, despite this catastrophic bleeding, the 4th Infantry Division was not relief authorized. No entire division was steaming across the ocean to take over. The front line, demanding bodies, could not be evacuated. The division was legally and strategically trapped in the Hurtgen meat grinder, ordered to attack again and again while their veteran combat strength was being annihilated. The entire American strategic hypothesis, the logic of the 90 division gamble, now hinged on a single, controversial logistical imperative. Since the division could not be withdrawn from the war, in the form of individual replacements, had to be continuously funneled into the division. As the 4th Infantry Division bled into the mud of the Hurtgen, the mathematics of the 90 division gamble demanded an immediate mechanical response. The moment a casualty report was radioed from a forward battalion command post, an invisible transatlantic conveyor belt engaged. There was no pause to reorganize, no operational halt to pull the survivors back to safety. Instead, a requisition for a human being was filed, processed as coldly and efficiently as a logistical request for a replacement tank tread or a crate of rifle ammunition. Hundreds of miles to the rear, in sprawling, muddy transit camps across liberated France, officially designated as replacement depots, bitterly known to the troops as Repeldeppels, the gears of this machine began to turn. These holding areas contained tens of thousands of freshly drafted infantrymen. Many were teenagers who, just weeks prior, had been civilians in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or California, hurriedly rushed through stateside training and ferried across the Atlantic. Now, they were awakened in the middle of a cold November night, their names called from typewritten manifests by quartermaster clerks. Loaded into endless convoys of 2.5-ton supply trucks, these individual replacements were driven straight through the freezing rain toward the echoing thunder of the front lines. They were not assigned to form a new cohesive unit. They were solitary assets, destined to be slotted blindly into the shattered gaps of the front line. Across the splintered landscape of the forest, the German defenders of units like the 275th Infantry Division were tracking the battle through a very different military doctrine. German artillery observers and forward commanders had meticulously logged the devastation they were inflicting. They knew the precise volume of high explosives they had poured onto the American grid coordinates. Based on standard European formulas of military attrition, German intelligence officers calculated that the American battalions opposing them had sustained well over 50% casualties within a matter of days. By the rigid logic of the Wehrmacht, the 4th Infantry Division was effectively destroyed. The American line should have been fractured, their offensive capabilities completely neutralized, and their remnants preparing to withdraw. Expecting to push through a collapsing front, German combat patrols probed forward in the twilight, only to run headlong into dense, sustained rifle fire. In the ensuing skirmishes, Wehrmacht troops captured a handful of American prisoners. When German intelligence officers pulled these captives into frontline bunkers and shone flashlights onto their wet uniforms, they found the familiar green ivy leaf patch of the 4th Division. But the interrogations yielded a deeply unsettling revelation. These prisoners were not the exhausted, shell-shocked veterans who had crossed the border days earlier. They were completely fresh recruits, men who did not even know the names of their own squad leaders, men who had stepped off a supply truck only hours before. For the German command, the tactical implications were terrifying. Their lethal, meticulously planned defensive victories were being instantly erased. They were fighting an enemy capable of regenerating its severed limbs overnight, directly under fire. The Americans were not replacing divisions. They were seamlessly reviving dead ones. But moving thousands of isolated, terrified replacements into a freezing forest was only half the equation. Sustaining a ghost division in perpetual combat, ensuring these newly arrived strangers did not simply freeze or run out of ammunition, required an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. To sustain this illusion of an unkillable division, the American military engineered a dual-directional logistical pipeline that operated with ruthless corporate efficiency. Before fresh troops could be fed into the meat grinder of the Hürtgen Forest, the shattered remnants of the previous battles had to be rapidly extracted. The American Medical Evacuation Network functioned as a high-speed reverse conveyor belt, specifically designed to unburden frontline commanders. In older European conflicts, a severely wounded soldier might languish in a trench for days, demoralizing his unit and consuming the attention of his surviving squad mates. By November 1944, the U.S. Army had industrialized battlefield medicine. The moment a rifleman from the 4th Infantry Division fell, company medics stabilized him under fire, attaching a standardized emergency medical tag to his uniform. From there, specialized litter-bearer teams, often utilizing modified jeeps fitted with stretcher racks, or tracked M29 weasels capable of navigating the deep mud, rushed the casualty out of the combat zone. Within hours, the soldier was processed through a battalion aid station, moved to a division clearing station, and ultimately transported to a massive, fully equipped evacuation hospital safely behind the lines. Backed by an unprecedented transatlantic supply of dried plasma, whole blood, and the newly mass-produced miracle drug penicillin, this system achieved a staggering statistic. If an American soldier reached a field hospital alive, he had a 96% chance of surviving. But this medical triumph served a cold, tactical purpose. It instantly cleared the battlefield of the dead and wounded, ensuring the frontline units were never bogged down by their own casualties, keeping the war machine pointed relentlessly forward. With the casualties physically erased from the tactical map, the secondary gears of the machine engaged to plug the massive material gaps. The War Department understood perfectly that a replacement soldier was useless if he was handed a broken weapon or left to freeze in the damp winter fog. To solve this, the Quartermaster Corps operated a supply chain that dwarfed the logistics of any other nation on Earth. Behind the 4th Infantry Division stretched a continuous, unbroken artery of cargo trucks, rolling day and night from the deep water ports of France directly to the tactical staging areas in Germany. When a regiment lost 500 M1 Garand rifles in a brutal 3-day engagement, they did not wait for a factory in Detroit to manufacture new ones. Rear echelon salvage units systematically stripped weapons, helmets, and web gear from the casualties, repaired them in mobile workshops, and pushed them directly back to the front. Ammunition was requisitioned and delivered not by the crate, but by the ton. Millions of rounds of small arms fire, tens of thousands of heavy artillery shells, dry wool socks, and insulated Marmite cans filled with hot food were driven straight into active artillery zones. The American front line was effectively tethered to an infinite industrialized warehouse. Yet, the most terrifying component of this machine was not the movement of metal, but the movement of men. To maintain the authorized strength of a division without pulling it off the line, the Army relied on the replacement depot system. This was where the mathematics of the 90 division gamble exacted its heaviest psychological toll. Consider the journey of a single individual replacement. He was typically an 18 or 19-year-old draftee, rushed through a condensed basic training cycle at a stateside base like Camp Blanding. Stripped of any permanent unit affiliation, he was loaded onto a converted ocean liner, shipped across the Atlantic, and deposited into a sprawling, muddy transit camp in Europe. He was treated exactly like a spark plug or a gallon of aviation fuel, a solitary commodity awaiting a bureaucratic requisition order. In the middle of the night, his name was called from a typewritten manifest. He was loaded into the back of a canvas-covered truck with a dozen other strangers and driven for hours toward the flash of artillery on the horizon. When the truck finally stopped in the freezing rain of the Hürtgen Forest, a clerk from the 12th Infantry Regiment checked his name off a list and pointed him toward a dark, waterlogged foxhole. This young man did not know his squad leader. He did not know the soldier shivering in the hole next to him. He had never trained with these men, did not know their tactical shorthand, and had absolutely no bonds of brotherhood to rely on. He was simply dropped into the dark, expected to immediately function as a veteran rifleman in one of the most complex, lethal environments on Earth. Across the splintered tree lines, the veteran German commanders of units like the 275th Infantry Division were watching this influx of fresh personnel, and initially, they completely misinterpreted what they were seeing. German military doctrine was built around the preservation of the unit core, relying heavily on experienced non-commissioned officers and deep, cohesive unit bonds. When German frontline officers observed the newly arrived American replacements, they saw glaring tactical incompetence. They watched these raw, bewildered recruits bunch up under mortar fire instead of dispersing. They saw them freeze at the distinct, terrifying mechanical rip of an MG-42 machine gun, unable to distinguish the sound of incoming fire from outgoing artillery. German combat patrols easily ambushed these isolated strangers, reporting back that the American infantry was panicking in the woods and suffering from a catastrophic lack of discipline. For a brief, fleeting moment, the German high command believed the American war machine was finally cracking under the pressure. They assumed that by forcing the United States to throw untrained boys into the frontline meat grinder, they had shattered the combat effectiveness of the American infantry. They believed the line was brittle, ready to collapse entirely under a concentrated counterattack. But that collapse never came, and German arrogance slowly mutated into a cold, paralyzing anxiety. The German artillery would zero in on an American position, systematically dismantling a company and inflicting what should have been war-ending casualties. By their calculations, the American line should have been a ghost town the next morning. Instead, when the Wehrmacht launched their dawn counterattacks, they were met by a fully manned perimeter, firing an identical, overwhelming volume of ammunition. German command logs from Army Group B began to reflect a grim, dawning realization. The frontline reports noted a robotic, horrifying consistency to the American logistics. It did not matter how many tactical mistakes the green American replacements made. It did not matter how many casualties the German veterans inflicted. Killing 1,000 men merely triggered a bureaucratic mechanism that summoned 1,000 more to the exact same grid coordinates within 48 hours. The German commanders realized they were not fighting a traditional military force that could be demoralized or exhausted. They were fighting an unstoppable factory conveyor belt. On paper, this logistical masterpiece was an undeniable triumph, ensuring the United States Army never had to halt its advance to rebuild its shattered divisions. But down in the freezing mud of the foxholes, this statistical perfection was masking a profound tactical tragedy. The tactical tragedy masked by this statistical perfection was the systematic destruction of unit cohesion. The War Department's assembly line treated infantrymen as interchangeable parts, fundamentally misunderstanding how human beings survive the psychological terror of modern combat. A soldier pinned down in a freezing forest does not fight for a grand geopolitical strategy, and he rarely fights for the divisional patch on his shoulder. He fights for the men immediately around him. But inside the 4th Infantry Division, those vital bonds of brotherhood were being continuously severed. The system that kept the division alive on paper was simultaneously killing its soul. When a terrified 19-year-old replacement was shoved into a frontline squad in the Hurtgen, he lacked the critical, unwritten survival skills that only cohesive training and shared experience could forge. He did not know how his squad leader signaled a silent flanking maneuver. He had not learned to identify the specific, localized sounds of incoming mortar fire echoing through the dense fir trees. Because he was a stranger to the men beside him, nobody instinctively watched his blind spots, and he did not know how to cover theirs. As a result, the casualty rates among these isolated newcomers were catastrophic. Statistical records from the period reveal a grim reality. A massive percentage of individual replacements were killed or severely wounded within their first 72 hours on the line. For the shrinking core of combat-hardened veterans, the men who had fought their way off Utah Beach and survived the liberation of Paris, this revolving door of death created an unbearable psychological burden. These veteran non-commissioned officers and riflemen were already deeply traumatized by the loss of their original friends. Now, they were forced to watch a continuous stream of fresh-faced teenagers march into the woods and rapidly disappear. A dark, unspoken survival mechanism took hold across the veteran ranks. They simply stopped asking the new men for their names. Learning a replacement's name, asking where he was from, or looking at a photograph of his family meant forming a human connection. Forming a connection with a man statistically likely to die before the end of the week was a psychological risk the exhausted veterans could no longer afford. The new arrivals became anonymous bodies, referred to only as kid or replacement. This created a devastating isolation. The drafted teenagers were fighting and dying, surrounded by men who actively refused to know them. This was the hidden, fatal flaw of the American logistics machine. The 4th Infantry Division remained at 100% authorized strength on the operational maps at headquarters, but its actual combat effectiveness was quietly collapsing. The experienced corps of officers and NCOs was being steadily hollowed out, replaced by a disjointed crowd of alienated strangers and emotionally walled-off survivors. This patchwork division, bleeding internally and stripped of its original cohesion, was barely holding together, and they were about to face the ultimate test of their fragile endurance. By early December 1944, 1st Army Command finally recognized that the 4th Infantry Division was operating on the brink of total psychological and tactical collapse. To prevent the unit from disintegrating entirely, they pulled the battered division from the Hürtgen Forest and sent it south to what was considered a ghost front, a quiet, heavily wooded sector along the Sauer River in Luxembourg. This was a supposedly safe zone, a dormant stretch of the Ardennes where the exhausted veterans could finally thaw out, sleep in actual buildings, and take the crucial time to integrate and learn the names of the thousands of raw replacements who now constituted the bulk of their fighting strength. But the quiet was a meticulously engineered illusion. On the morning of December 16th, at exactly 5:30 a.m., the winter sky above the American positions erupted in a blinding sheet of fire. It was the devastating opening artillery barrage of the massive German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The 4th Infantry Division was instantly plunged into a nightmare scenario. They were stretched impossibly thin, tasked with defending a 35-mile front that, according to standard doctrine, required an entire corps to hold. As the German artillery severed telephone wires and systematically dismantled command posts, the division rapidly splintered into dozens of isolated, cut-off pockets. Through the freezing fog and dense snow, veteran German shock troops and advancing elements of the 7th Army began crossing the river, entirely expecting to smash through a fragile, disorganized American line. And by every conventional military metric, the German assessment was correct. The men waiting in the snow-filled foxholes and fortified stone houses around villages like Echternach and Burdorf were not a cohesive, elite fighting force. They were, overwhelmingly, terrified teenagers who had never fired a weapon in anger, huddled next to hollowed-out veterans who had spent the last month actively refusing to form emotional bonds with them. They shared no history, possessed no rehearsed tactical shorthand, and completely lacked the unified bonds of brotherhood that traditional armies relied upon. As the first waves of field gray infantry materialized through the morning mist, these disjointed clusters of strangers were forced into a chaotic, life-or-death trial by fire. The protective luxury of the American industrial supply chain, the endless trucks of ammunition, and the rapid medical evacuations was suddenly severed by the German advance. Everything now depended on the raw, terrifying reality of the individual replacement system. The surviving non-commissioned officers had to instantly step up, barking critical orders to teenagers whose names they still did not know. And those raw replacements, trembling in the sub-zero temperatures, had to suppress their paralyzing fear, shoulder their M1 Garand rifles, and immediately function as the veteran infantrymen they were supposed to be. The stakes were absolute. The 4th Division anchored the critical southern shoulder of the entire American defensive line. If they collapsed, the German armored spearheads would have a clear, undefended path to encircle the Allied armies. Against all traditional military logic, the fractured, hollowed-out remnants of this division had to prove whether a cold, assembly line military of interchangeable parts could actually withstand a direct existential blow. The fragmented remnants of the 4th Infantry Division held the line. Over the next harrowing week, those isolated pockets of alienated replacements and exhausted veterans absorbed the full weight of the German 7th Army and refused to break. They successfully anchored the southern shoulder of the Ardennes, denying the German armored spearheads the critical road networks they desperately needed to encircle the Allied forces. But this strategic victory was purchased at a staggering, deeply unsettling human cost. The brutal defense in Luxembourg finally proved to the German High Command the terrifying reality of American industrial warfare. By late December 1944, Wehrmacht generals studying the frozen battlefields were forced to admit a fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation. They had operated under the traditional belief that if you killed enough men in a division, the unit would shatter, its morale would collapse, and it would cease to exist as a fighting force. Instead, They realized they were not fighting a fixed number of soldiers whose bodies and spirits could be broken. They were fighting an endless, mechanized conveyor belt of logistics, medical evacuation, and raw manpower that simply could not be exhausted. The United States Army was winning the war of attrition, not merely through superior battlefield tactics or traditional heroism, but through an uncompromising, factory-like system that defied every established limit of military endurance. This was the chilling triumph of the 90 Division gamble. The American military had effectively solved the brutal mathematics of global warfare by designing a logistical engine that treated human lives as endless, interchangeable fuel. It was a mathematically cold strategy that ensured the Allied war machine never had to pause, never had to retreat to rebuild, and never stopped pressing relentlessly forward toward the Rhine. To the terrified German defenders, and to the American public reading the newspaper headlines back home, the familiar green ivy leaf patch of the 4th Division remained a constant, unyielding presence on the map. It projected a flawless illusion of invincibility, a legendary unit that could survive any artillery barrage and defeat any counterattack. But that iconic emblem was hiding a dark, devastating reality beneath the snow. The patch of the 4th Infantry Division never left the front lines, acting as a terrifying, unyielding constant for the bewildered German defenders. But behind that familiar green ivy emblem, the original unit had ceased to exist, completely transformed into a sprawling, tragic ghost ship devoid of its initial crew. It was kept afloat not by shared history or traditional brotherhood, but by a ruthless, uncompromising mathematics that viewed human beings as infinitely interchangeable components for an industrialized war machine that simply refused to stop running, relentlessly feeding thousands of anonymous strangers into the fire just to keep a single phantom division marching forward.